G'day, I've been your imaginary underworld apostate, not Jar Witness, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
I started reading the Gospels to learn what Jesus taught about living a good life, and found that he taught much more about his identity as God and the nature of eternal life. I knew that it would be hard to accept one dimension of his teaching while rejecting the others. If you were a real skeptic, reading an account of a guy who had a few good teachings but mostly kept talking about how he was God and you could live forever, you wouldn't find the story more compelling. You would say, "Wow, this is stupid," and stop reading. Thus we can see this paragraph as clearly being the writing of a longtime believer concocting a fictional or at least highly altered story of his own skeptical past and conversion. You have to have your head pretty far up Christianity's ass if you don't immediately recognize this. And to me, this just goes to show that Wallace knows the audience he's writing for.
See, this is an oversimplified perspective that ignores how complicated human beings can be. I mean, you're allowed to have a lot of respect for an individual and think that they give really good advice a lot of the time, and at the same time acknowledge that they're not right about everything, especially if they say they're magic. Like, let's be controversial here. Let's bring up Jordan Peterson and get lots of YouTube views.
Wow.
But, you know, I know people,
right.
I know people who like Jordan Peterson, who, you know, like what he has to say about getting your life together, getting yourself organized, cleaning up your
straight,
act,
clean
and
your
stuff
room.
like that. And that's legit good advice, but you don't need to accept that and then be like, well, I also need to accept what he has to say about women in the workplace, or I need to accept what he has to say about male-female dynamics and people
Dominance hierarchies
and lobsters and and other stuff like that. You can critically evaluate these things, and it's weird that that Wallace claims that, you know, he's capable of doing this when it comes to the resurrection, but he feels like you have to take all of Jesus or none of Jesus.
I can kind of see where he's coming from, because, well, despite what a lot of people think, Jordan B. Peterson is not divine. But in the case of Jesus, if you go in with the premise that he's divine, you've got to believe everything that comes out of his mouth.
But, okay, a more direct analogy would be is if you like Jordan B. Peterson's advice about getting your life together, and he goes on to claim that he's the second coming of Christ, do you need to accept the latter because you appreciate the former?
Okay, that's the reverse order. If you accept the latter, you have to accept the former. But if you accept the former, you don't necessarily have to accept the latter.
Well, it's kind of the whole, Christians don't like it when you say, well, Jesus was a good teacher. Like, no, you have to take all or nothing. Like, no, you really don't, though. Hitchens
says exactly that. You may claim he was a great teacher. You may claim that he was a wise man, that he was that he taught, that he had good wisdom, and he imparted important things to the world. But you can't just stop there. And Hitchens said, he did not give us that option. If you consider what is written down in the New Testament as the words of Jesus, he did not leave that open for us. He did not leave that. You have to either go with he was divine and everything that came out of his mouth was true, or he was the biggest liar on earth.
Or how about this? Let's make it even more complicated. Let's say 40 years from now, someone writes a biography of Jordan B. Peterson. The whole byline of this is going to be, YouTubers compare Jordan B. Peterson with Jesus Christ. Well, let's say 40 years from now, someone writes a biography of Peterson, and they repeat all the stuff that he said in his books, but they add that, and then he died for your sins.
Oh, they tacked it on later.
Yeah.
A posthumous divinity.
His legend has grown to the point where he's now a saint in Canada, and he has churches devoted for him.
That's how every divine person throughout history, name them. There's hundreds of them. That's how they all start off. If they were first an actual human. Sometimes they start out completely mythical. But the ones that were actually humans, they started off doing good things, teaching people, imparting wisdom, and many of them don't get the title of divine or godlike until after their death.
Yeah, maybe he's just a cool guy, and I don't worship him, but I like reading his stuff.
And who's that guy? Who's that guy in India? He was still alive when they started thinking he was God.
Oh, the
Sai Baba something.
yeah, I know.
Ali Sai Baba.
Something Baba that I'm not going to even try and
Damn
pronounce.
it! It's on your screen right now. He was deified well before his death by a substantial portion of India.
And we have him talking in his own words, written by him.
And every bit of it,
we know he existed.
Yeah, we do.
As a skeptic, I believed that the Gospels were penned in the 2nd century and were similarly worthless. If they were written that late, they were not eyewitnesses' accounts. It is really as simple as that. You know, I've only been an atheist for about 6 or 7 years now. I've been aware of the mythicist position for about 10. And I can't think of a single time that I ever heard somebody say it was 200 to 300 years after the alleged death of Jesus. I would probably very similarly think that if we got that far away with the New Testament, that would be evidence of itself that it's almost certainly a myth. However, the far more common scholarly view is 70 to 100 years, not 200 to 300.
This is another weird oversight by Wallace, and I think he's doing it so he can strawman his opposition. I mean, I know he says that as a skeptical atheist, that he thought the Gospels were written centuries after Jesus' life. But he contrasts that with his current view that all the Gospels were written pretty early, like in the 50s, 60s AD. He completely does not address the proposition that the Gospels were written 70 to 100 AD after the destruction of the temple, which is the most consistently held position that I find among scholars, both Christian and otherwise. So I don't know why he's not addressing the foremost position that probably a lot of his readers have, and going with this very, very far outlier of a date in the 2nd, 3rd century that I know very few people who actually seriously hold to that.
We're going back to the muzzle in the ox and the labor one. All right, so one's Old Testament, and it's kind of an old thing that everyone said back then. So that one's dismissed. But the one about, say it again.
Labor is worthy of his hire.
All right, so that one seems like something, just one of those figures of speech that it was commonly said. So that aside, and so that I can dismiss my cognitive dissonance that I'm feeling right now, right? So you discount that whole cloth, correct? You still place the Gospels well after the Pauline epistles, yes?
Yeah, I mean, it's...
Which is in line with consensus.
I'm a lay person now. I'm trying to sort through the scholarship. I'm not going to say I'm absolutely correct on it, but I generally... in my uneducated opinion, I think that if there's a viewpoint that both secular and Christian scholars agree on, then it's probably more likely to be right. Like, I know of no secular scholars who hold to an early gospel date, and I know of no Christian scholars who hold to a very, very late gospel date, 2nd, 3rd century. So I feel like that middle ground is probably a reasonable place for me to look at it from my end, not having just all the knowledge that it would take to.
We don't have to be experts. There's enough information we can read. We can look at the evidence, so we can make our own layperson conclusion to this, and to avoid risking an ad populum fallacy. But I do look at the consensus. I do look at the experts in the field. What is the consensus there? And they put it at 70 to 100.
And Wallace notes that I don't know if it will be on the channel after or before this series.
It's before. It's going out in the next week or two.
Awesome. So you can see Wallace's interview from the last book club meeting, and he says specifically he does not go with biblical scholars. He goes by the data points and examines them for himself, and he comes to his own conclusions, which he's allowed to do, but he has to realize that he's going against the experts in the field, and he is definitely not an expert in biblical scholarship, nor should he be held out as one.
He made that very clear in the interviews we did with him, that he even implied that he goes with his gut over expert evaluation, and he made it very clear. He stressed the point that he does not really even care what the experts say, not a bit. He's going to look at it from his own perspective, and that's it. He doesn't. It's like the experts. They even if they proved his point, he doesn't care.
Yeah, it's like saying, I'm going to bake a cake, but I'm not going to go with the ingredients that these quote-unquote expert bakers say I should use. I'm going to include meat drippings and wood shavings, and that'll be fine.
And forget a recipe too.
Oh no.
We just jumped the gun a little bit. Okay.
Bit. I deliberately didn't say this part.
All right.
So this is one of his dating points that he uses to imply an early date for the Gospels, but I don't think it's a good point, because the Gospels they're about the life of Jesus, right? They don't quote anything that happened after he died, because they weren't part of his life. And nor should you expect that anything that happened decades later would be included in his biography. It's like expecting a book about Watergate to talk about the 9/11 attacks. 9/11 was a watershed moment in American history, much like the destruction of the temple was a watershed moment in history of Israel. But that doesn't mean you have to talk about it when discussing events that happened 40 years prior. It's just not applicable.
I've heard this so many times. Believers that I talk to, the biggest event of that time period might be the first to be omitted because it's common knowledge. So the omission of it would just be almost expected.
And I think maybe it wasn't Wallace, maybe it was another discussion, but the point was made that if the Gospels were written after the destruction of the temple, then they would have ended, after Jesus made the prophecy, they would have said something like, and so it came to pass that the temple was destroyed,
right.
or something like that, including the fulfillment after the prophecy to show that it was fulfilled.
Or it was embellished.
Or like you said, everyone knew the temple was destroyed, so they would be like, "Oh, he predicted that." Like you don't need to say that.
Yeah, exactly. And okay, synoptic gospels aside, right off the bat, we know that John wasn't written by John. Now, I say often, none of the gospels were written by who they claim to have been. And I have various reasons, like the oldest manuscripts we have don't have the gospel according to Matthew on them, for instance. That was added later. We know this. Mm-hmm. The oldest ones don't have the gospel according to Mark as the title. Those, we know that's objectively was added later. Mm-hmm. That's good evidence. Second, okay, let's forget about the synoptic gospels. John, there's even a passage in John that pretty much it's a smoking gun that John didn't write John. And I can't remember it word for word. It's on your screen right now. And if it's not on your screen right now, it means I'm fucked up and I'm misremembering.
You won't even hear this because we're going to edit it out.
Right.
Because we edit out all the parts where we're wrong.
That's right. But hopefully there's something on your screen right now that is definitive evidence that John didn't write John.
This is why Paul was able to tell the Corinthians that there were still more than 500 brethren who could confirm the resurrection accounts. 1 Corinthians 15:6. That's a gutsy claim to make in AD 53 to 57, when his readers could easily have accepted his challenge and called him out as a liar if the claim was untrue. Even assuming this claim was made as written to a contemporary audience, was it really that gutsy for a guy in Corinth to invent a story about 500 eyewitnesses in Judea? What was he afraid was going to happen? that someone would brave the treacherous 800-mile trip to Judea? That he would start asking around for unnamed people who saw something happen 20 years ago, ultimately scouring the entire land and determining that none of the unnamed eyewitnesses existed? That even if he did manage to discover Paul was lying, he would come back and argue this point with charismatic church leaders in front of a hostile audience? That's what you think he was afraid of? This is far from an airtight, compelling argument that there must have actually been eyewitnesses.
Okay, this is the apologetic that bothers me probably more than anything else, because every apologist talks about it like it's a smoking gun. And if you just think of that for 2 seconds, it doesn't make any sense, because none of the Gospels talk about the 500 eyewitnesses, first of all. They don't have to, per se, but it would be a nice thing to talk about. But why do apologists act like people in Corinth had ready, easy access to eyewitnesses in Judea? They didn't have telephones or internet or telegrams, radios, Pony Express, any easy, instantaneous or near instantaneous communication. If you wanted to go there, it was 800 miles by boat, and you'd have to up and leave your job in a time when you probably didn't have paid time off, and finance your own trip to Judea. And there's about 600,000 people in Judea at this time, according to Tacitus, so you'd have to actually...
How many?
600,000?
Yeah.
And you have to find one of 500 people in this whole province, and you didn't have like a handy-dandy phone book that listed like the white pages are all the eyewitnesses to the resurrection. And of course it's probably even less than 500 because people have died during this time, so you need to find even fewer than 500 people among 600,000. And you don't just need to find one person, you need to find at least 2 of them, because you're not just going to go to Judea and take the word of the first schmuck that you meet who says they saw the risen Jesus. You got to find someone who's going to corroborate their story. To just take it for granted that, you could so easily debunk Paul's statement, why would he make it if it weren't true? It's just nonsense.
There's way too many holes in this boat. I'm surprised they even put it in the book, because it's flimsy. Just everything you said, plus, how many times have you heard a believer, well, 500 witnesses couldn't be wrong, Jesus had to have done all that. It wasn't 500 witnesses. It was one guy talking about 500 witnesses. But you talk to your average Joe Schmo believer out there, he's going to tell you 500 witnesses in the Bible. No, it was one guy that claimed the 500 witnesses. And everything you said, no internet, 800 miles away, 600,000 people in there, how easily malleable and manipulated and open to suggestion and easily influenced were people back then. Everyone was wanting to, Life of Brian, again, oh, a gourd, oh, a sandal. People were just grasping it. There was a street preacher on every corner, and people were buying into all of them.
And not even back then. People are easily influenced now. Like, it's not like there was some fundamental change in human brains making people more gullible back then. People think flat Earth is still a thing in
It's easier to fact check now. That's the only difference.
It is easier to fact check now.
That's the only difference.
That's the difference. And talk about, having differing standards for things. Wallace is going to spend like chapters of this book talking about how you can corroborate stuff in the Gospels with archaeology, history, with other Gospels, with other writings. And yet here's a statement that is not corroborated anywhere, and he just takes it at face value that Paul was being legit here. He completely ignores his own standards for wanting to corroborate stuff when it fits his side.
We're in Texas right now. I'll bet you a paycheck I could go to the nearest Walmart and find one person that thinks, if I gave him a claim, hey, sir, do you think that Trump's presidential inauguration was the biggest turnout of any inauguration, according to what the press secretary said? Oh, absolutely. You did see the video, right? You saw the photos, you saw the footage, and you've heard the claim. With all the information that you have, or you show them a picture, yeah, it was fake news. Yeah, it was the biggest inauguration. That's what the press secretary. You think that I could find? I bet you I could find 500.
Well, shit, this is Texas. You can go to any Walmart and find someone who thinks Trump is the second coming of Jesus.
Right, but that claim that the inauguration, Sean Spicer said it was, the next day it was the largest turnout for any inauguration ever. And of course we see the photos lined up against everyone else's, and it was a very small turnout comparatively. But you will still have people now in the internet, in the information age, refuse to accept it.